So, coming to you from Annapolis, Maryland. This is actually part of Annapolis that's called Eastport. It's similar to Brooklyn, I suppose, in the sense that it used to be an independent town before it was annexed by Annapolis proper. Brooklyn, of course, was annexed in 1898. I think Eastport was annexed by Annapolis in 1959, 1961, but as you can see on the flag there, it says the Maritime Republic of Eastport. It's kind of a drunken, clever joke. But it's still an independent town in some people's minds. So I'm starting this motovlog, basically to have something to do. I'm currently on the job hunt, so occupies my time. And do something a bit different. I think I'm mostly going to talk sort of about culture and history of the places I go. I travel a lot, by bike often. And today, historically, I'm going to talk about something that's very important to Maryland as a town. It's also important up north in Canada, and that's the War of 1812. The reason it comes to mind is that you can look at the license plates here. You'll see that they say Maryland, War of 1812. It was funny because I went to visit a buddy of mine in Ottawa a few weeks ago. It was actually a miserable ride because on the way back it was absolutely freezing. We were coming right out of a polar vortex, so I was heading back in 18 degrees and wearing 3 layers, and it was still horrible. But I'd stopped for gas. At one point, a guy saw my license plate, and he said, "Oh, why are you guys commemorating a war that you lost?" And, in my mind, we didn't. We didn't lose it. And you guys didn't win it. But you guys also didn't lose it. Tried. It was a complete stalemate. And it was also a war that no one really achieved anything. And no one really lost anything. And it was also completely unnecessary. And the story with that goes that following the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which secured U.S. independent sovereignty, there were a few issues with it. Naturally, that's why he signed the Jay Treaty in order to help solidify some national boundaries that had kind of been left out. And another issue is the idea of American citizenship. The British were impressing U.S. sailors at the time from merchant vessels into the Royal Navy. And part of that is because there were some deserters who would join the U.S. Navy when they got to port. They would pretty much switch over their allegiance. I mean, it was easy. There wasn't a language issue. The cultures were very similar at the time. And the British needed naval manpower because at the time they were dealing with Napoleon. This is the early 1800s that we're speaking about, just before the War of 1812, which acquires its name for obvious reasons. And essentially, the U.S. was getting really riled up about this. I mean, you would be too if today, I don't know, the Chinese or the Russians or someone was stopping U.S. trading ships and bringing U.S. citizens into their own service. And that's where the gray area for the British began, because they believed that citizenship was acquired from birth. I mean, think about it. American war heroes like George Washington, they weren't born American, they were born British. They became American after the Treaty of Paris was signed. And so that's one of the issues. Another one of the issues is that following the quasi-war with France, that's the trading war and naval conflict that we had with the new French Republic, because we owed France millions and millions following the Revolutionary War. And then Naturally, the French Revolution began in 1792, and the monarchy was deposed. So the U.S. said, hey, the guy that we owed money to is gone, so we don't owe France any more money. So we fought for a while with that. But afterwards, U.S. and France began trading again. And everything's hunky-dory, especially when this guy called Napoleon turns around, who's fighting the British, who were impressing U.S. sailors. And the U.S. continues to make a profit off of this, and France is happy. Napoleon sells his western territories to the U.S. in the Louisiana Purchase. That's part of Manifest Destiny later on, but before all of that, the U.S. is just happy as can be doing this. But that's a problem for the British, because American money and American trade is benefiting the enemy. So there starts to develop this rise against American commercial trade with France, and everyone's trying to figure out what to do about it. And the British believed that creating buffer states against the United States is the angle that they should take. One was supposed to be around Maine, sort of separate Canada and the Americans. The Americans had tried and failed to conquer parts of Canada during the American Revolution. That failed. And also in Florida, they also wanted to create a buffer state in Florida to prevent the U.S. from reaching the Caribbean so easily. So you see these tensions rising. And eventually it gets to the point when the Americans are just absolutely fed up with it. And the British, on the other side, unbeknownst to the Americans at the time, were also beginning to get worried about how much they were tempting the United States, because they needed commercial trade with the U.S. too. The U.S. was developing a lot of raw goods, cotton, one of the big producers, a lot of agriculture, indigo, especially in South Carolina and regions like that. And they wanted in on the trade. And here's where there's a guy called David Erskine. He was Britain's ambassador to the United States at the start of the War of 1812. And he was one of those guys in history who was just an ineffective communicator. He routinely misrepresented British policy towards the American government. And it wasn't necessarily his fault, because if you think about it, Britain was a constitutional monarchy like it is today, a bit less representative, but that's just the way things were. But because communication was so slow, what David Erskine never knew is that the British government had changed its policy regarding American citizenship. It was no longer meant by birth. They annulled previous legislations and said, okay, American citizens are American citizens, and we're not going to impress their sailors anymore. But by the time the Americans learned this, there's a big problem. They declared war on Great Britain. They're going to, and the goal is to capture some British land, kind of force the Brits into accepting a peace and stopping the impressment of American sailors. And I will get right back to that as soon as I complete this errand.